So, this is the second week of our sermon series looking through the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is a letter, actually, that Paul writes to a group of people in Ephesus, a church that he started and spent 2 years establishing before he was kind of run out of town. Paul had a habit of writing letters. Through the New Testament, he wrote letters to the churches in Ephesus, a few in Corinth, Philippi, Colossae, Galatia, and Thessaloniki, it's known now. So anyway, here you go. And some of those, he wrote a number of letters to each of those. But there is something unique about this letter to the Ephesians. And it's this. In all those other letters, he's writing to correct or challenge or rebuke something that's happening in the church, some leadership thing going on or some weirdo theology that seems to have crept into the church and stuff that he's kind of trying to correct. But Ephesians is just a nice letter. Just a letter to say g'day, how you doing? Which is nice, yeah? Yeah. So he starts by reminding them of the beliefs that they share, their common beliefs, and then to encourage them to continue to build and grow their church community. Last week, Lillian built for us a foundation of belief where she explained that Paul was all about an experiential, deep knowledge of God. Not a shallow head knowledge. It's not about theological knowledge or rational understandings. There's a deep experiential knowledge of God that's on offer and required. If you missed last week's message, it is up on the Moreland Salmons YouTube channel, and I encourage you to go and look it up. Is this microphone dropping in and out? You're good? Good. So this week, we're in Ephesians 2. And as Ephesians continues through in this letter, he shifts more from, what we believe to more about, well, what difference does that make? More practical instructions, and which I like. I'm a practical, down-to-earth kind of person. So what difference does it make that God loves us? Well, the first thing that we find here in this text is that Christians act and react to the world together. Together. We're a together bunch. I think we've learned the importance of being together over the last couple of years, haven't we? No more so than you guys here in Melbourne. But that's not really the kind of together that Paul's talking about. Paul's society at the time was pretty fractured in lots of different ways. There were insiders, there were outsiders, particularly when it came to the Jewish culture. There were the circumcised and the uncircumcised, the clean, the unclean, the Jew, the Gentile, the Greek, the barbarian, the acceptable and the unacceptable, the pure and the impure. There were those of different civic classes, senators, citizens, freemen, slaves. And they were not ever found together much in their culture. And our culture really, perhaps not as formalised, but it isn't that much different. Particularly when it comes to our church culture, sadly. I was talking to someone this week who was telling me that their daughter went to a church with their family for a while, and they discovered that women couldn't preach there. They could lead a Bible study or a Sunday school lesson, but they couldn't lead and preach in the same way other members of the congregations could. I also spoke to someone last week who used to go to a church, but when their son came out as gay, they were suddenly felt very unwelcome and left the church. Heaven knows how the son felt. So this Mother's Day, here in Ephesians 2, we're going to talk about togetherness, or, to use a buzzword from pop culture, we're going to talk about inclusivity. Because in our culture, I'm sure you're aware, there is a very big push, a very big call for togetherness, for inclusivity. A call to fully include all kinds of people in everything. All over the place, cultural, historical barriers are being challenged and broken down. Enmities and hostilities are being undone. And the church, having spent thousands of years reinforcing some of these barriers, whether we did it intentionally or not, is having a hard time dealing with it. Race barriers, Gender barriers, sexual orientation barriers, economic barriers, and class barriers all exist within the church. Many churches don't accept women preachers, as we've said. Many churches don't allow divorced people to remarry. Many churches don't welcome LGBTQ people. In America, the most segregated time is Sunday morning. The most segregated place in America is the church, where there are many black churches and white churches. We, the church worldwide, have a long way to go before we fully include people of all races, ethnicities, genders, orientations, classes, and so on. So I like the way Tim Keller, you guys heard of Tim Keller? Tim Keller is the, recently retired pastor of New York Presbyterian Church. But anyway, he says this. This is how he summarizes this second half of Ephesians chapter 2. He says, the church is a supernatural community made up of members who have undergone spiritual heart surgery and now live with a radical new identity. It's interesting, isn't it? That's a clear definition of the church if ever I saw one, and I love it. So let's unpack it a little bit. I want to talk for a quick moment about supernatural community. Then I want to talk about spiritual surgery, spiritual heart surgery, and then we'll talk about our new identity. Is that okay? Okay, so supernatural community. If you have a Bible, you might want to flick down to verses 19 and 20 of chapter 2. 1, 2, Mum. Oh, this is going to go on for ages. See, in these two verses, Paul runs through 3 quick metaphors to try and describe this supernatural community. First, he says it's being citizens of the same country. Consequently, you're no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens. Now, you may know that Paul was a Roman citizen. And in that time, being a Roman citizen wasn't the same as being like an Australian citizen. It was much, much more rare, perhaps more like being a member of the Order of Australia, an OAM. Like, they were super rare to be a citizen. And also, in Paul's day, it gave him extra privileges. It gave him prestige. He had an authority that could order magistrates around when they'd done the wrong thing. So, Paul's description here basically is to say, being in a church means you belong. It means you have exactly the same rights as me or anyone else around here. You may not have the same responsibilities, although I'm happy to give you some if you want. You have the same right as anybody to assume any responsibility. But then he says, you know what, being a citizen, that's not close enough. That doesn't quite capture it. He says, you know what, being in a church is like being in a family of the same household, or in some translations, having the same surname. But I'm not sure about this metaphor either, to be honest. I mean, we've talked already about families not being always the best. I was told this week, how many of you are married? Wow, you're not very confident about it. Not very, excited by the whole fact. But if you look at the person you're married to, not Wacker and Nigel, you're not, no. I want you to take a look at the person you're married to if they're here. But did you know, and if you're planning to get married, this is probably something important to know. Did you know that the person you marry is statistically the person most likely to murder you? Did you know that? I didn't know that. My wife told me that out of the blue this week. I don't know why. She might be trying to say something. I don't know. We recognise that human families aren't always the best, but the best of families give us a glimpse of the ideal, what the heavenly family, what a godly family, the kind of family that Paul refers to here, the family we try to emulate. But then Paul goes further than that. Not enough to be citizens, not enough to be family. He now goes into saying, well, we're going to be blocks, bricks, cemented together. built on the foundation of the apostles with Christ Jesus himself as a chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. See, if we can get past the little default little prejudices and dislikes and discomforts, we'll find that we share a deep spiritual bond with Christians of all types and kinds. It is a supernatural community. I remember being a bus driver at the ICO in London. Meant that occasionally other groups of delegates to the ICO, this is the International College for Officers, so there are Salvation Army people from all around the world there, and this one time I was asked to drive a bus load of people up to Tesco's, and I got in the bus, and in got about 6 of the South Asian ladies who are, average height of about 4 foot nothing, and I am 6'2", white as white can be, and they are Indian and Pakistani and Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi. And anyway, we drove up to Tesco, and there I was, and it was like being with sisters, right? It was hilariously fun. We were wandering around shopping together, but the looks was bizarre. People thought it was just the bizarrest thing to see a big, tall, white guy with 6 Asian ladies. It was kind of amusing. We get past the differences. We get past the little things that make us different, and we find that we share supernatural community. But I will repeat, the church isn't always brilliant, right? Paul wrote all these other letters to lots of other churches, correcting them and challenging them and telling them to get it better, because they weren't always that great. I'm going to switch to this one. So, the church is a supernatural community made up of members who have undergone spiritual heart surgery. Now, the reason we call this spiritual heart surgery is because when we become Christians, like we said in chapter 1, like you need to go back and look at the message if you missed it, right? This deep experiential changes the way we feel. Not only does it change the way we feel about God and how we understand God, it changes the way we feel about other people. It changes our hearts. It's not that we just change our minds and decide that we're going to accept women preachers or gay people or poor people or whoever else. It's how we feel that changes. And those things are removed. See, God removes things, removes blockages, removes tumors in this kind of surgical metaphor. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier dividing the dividing wall of hostility. He removed the barrier. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. Hostility is the word used for the NIV. Sometimes it's translated enmity. More often we'd interpret the word now as hate. And according to Paul, the experience of God, the infusing of the Holy Spirit into one's life, slowly brings about a change in which hostility or hate is surgically removed. Paul is talking here, and he uses an example. And the example is them, the Ephesians that he's writing to. See, the Ephesians that he's writing to were non-Jewish. They were Gentiles, unclean, impure, barbaric, unenlightened. The Jewish people had no time for Gentiles. If the Jewish people were the same way today, they didn't then believe in hell the same way we do, but if they did, they would have had plastered all over the place, all Gentiles are going to hell. That would be clearly stated. No problems with that statement at all. But here, Paul is writing to Ephesians, Gentiles, and they are not going to hell. They've experienced God. They've been filled with the Spirit. They are a supernatural community infused with the presence of God. Paul says, remember how God showed you that you weren't going to hell? But don't take any of this for granted. It was only yesterday, you outsiders to God's ways, had no idea of any of this. You didn't know the first thing about the way God works. So how did God solve this problem? How did God remove the enmity that existed between Jew and Gentile, and as an example to the rest of us? Well, Paul says it was dealt with by Jesus.
He repealed the law code that had become so clogged with fine print and footnotes that it hindered more than it helped. Then he started over. Instead of continuing with two groups of people separated by centuries of animosity and suspicion, he created a new kind of human being, a fresh start for everybody. Jesus removed the barrier. Jesus brought them together. Jesus died. He didn't die more for one group than another. He died for all. And that's what's interesting about verse 16, if you're following along. The Gentiles were far from God, right? They didn't have the Bible, as it says. They didn't have God's revelation through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They didn't have the history. They didn't have the tradition. They didn't have Moses, the law, and the prophets. They didn't have all that stuff. But on the other hand, the Jews, they were very close to God. They were the chosen ones. They had the law. They were given it. They were given the history and the tradition and the knowledge, the enlightenment. But Jesus died to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. Both of them required reconciliation. The death of Jesus sets aside the law, the regulations, commands, and condemnations, and elevates everyone to an equal standing before God by giving us all a new identity. So the church is a supernatural community made up of members who have undergone radical heart surgery, having those hates and animosities and things continuously removed, and now live with a radical new identity. I don't want to upset anybody, but some of us are Jews in this room or online. Some are Gentiles. Some are Australians. Some aren't. Some of us are men. Some of us are women. Some are young, some are old, some are blue-collar type people, some are white-collar type people. Some are heterosexual, some are homosexual, some are probably asexual, but some are retired, some wish they were retired. Some of us are traditional salvos, some of us are progressive salvos. Some of us are white, some of us aren't, some of us are left-handed, some not. Some are Labor voters, some are Liberal voters. I didn't get cheers for either of those. Okay, that's good. Some might be green or teal voters. But above all these things, all these labels, distinctions, and categories is an identity that unites us. We are Christians. We don't hate people not like us, because we are all like us. We are brothers and sisters. We embrace, affirm, and encourage. We love, because we are Christians. One of the greatest songs of the last few hundred years has been the song Amazing Grace, right? And I love the line in the song, and it's an odd line to appreciate. The phrase, saved a wretch like me. Saved a wretch like me. And I love the line because it is a leveling statement. A wretch is the lowest of the low. You can't look at your neighbour and say, I'm a better wretch than you. Doesn't work, right? I think Nigel just tried it. Did it work? No. We were at one point the lowest of the low. Until that glorious day when we were saved. The day when we were saved. Do you know the day when you were saved? I love the story of a pastor talking at a youth event or whatever, and he's talking to a young guy, and a young smart aleck. And as they used to do, the preachers and evangelists, they used to say, you should remember the day you were saved and all that sort of stuff. They used to get really carried away with that. And does anyone remember that? Am I just remembering wrongly? You remember that, right? No? Got to remember the day you were saved? Well, the smart aleck kid responded, well, I don't know the exact day, but it was about 2,000 years ago. You were saved 2,000 years ago, whether you accept it or not. You are loved, elevated, along with all of us, into the very throne room of God. I wonder if you would stand with me and we'll sing Amazing Grace. how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, and now I see. Let's sing this together.